Okay, just like to start off with something a bit easier for everyone. Maybe we can start on the end with Liam. And I just want to ask each of you how you got your start in being a film critic, and who are your formative influences?
I've sometimes joked that there's two kinds of film critics. There's people who set out to be film critics, and there's people who were too old for the rock beat. And I'm afraid I'm in the second category. I covered feature writing, popular music, theater, television. We had an unfortunate situation where we had this quite famous critic at the time, J. Scott, who died fairly young in his early 40s in 1993. And for 2 years, the Globe and Mail continued with one critic, and I was the person they decided to fill in at that point, because I had sort of general experience. I had worked as second, third string type film critic on and off for different years through the 80s, and had that mostly meant reviewing horror films. So I had people certainly that I had always enjoyed reading. I had Andrew Saris from his American Director's book and such things. I followed the writers in The Village Voice a lot. And I must say that the point where I was appointed to the job, I went looking in the bookstores to bolster my knowledge, and I did pick up two of Jonathan's books at the time, because you were looking for those things that would, collections of essays that would contextualize things. And Jay himself, I suppose, was an influence, although we weren't that much difference in age. And that pretty much covers it.
Well, I didn't myself set out to be a film critic, but I was, from a very early age, I was interested in being a writer. That's almost been lifelong, I would say. But I did have a very early interest in film because I was lucky enough to grow up in a small town where my grandfather ran a small chain of movie theaters, and my father worked for my grandfather. So I was able to see virtually all the movies that came to town for free, and I saw most of them. And then when I went away to school, I started becoming interested in some of the kind of art films, I guess you would say, and foreign language films that I hadn't been able to see very, very often as a child. And so I formed a film society, like a film series in college where I showed films and booked them and kind of conducted a film education that way, a Friday night series. And part of my college days were spent in New York City, where it was a great time to be because this was the period when I was seeing for the first time, when they opened, films like Hiroshima Mon Amour and A Bout de Souffle and L'Avventura and so on. So I think what I actually was intending to have an academic career in literature. That was what I studied in college. But I kind of got disenchanted with that, so much so that I was actually buying college outlines of the books I was supposed to be reading because I was afraid if I read the originals it would ruin it for me in the courses I was taking. And it was during the Vietnam War, and I didn't want to, I was even considering coming here if I was going to be drafted, but then I was fortunate I wasn't. And when I got to the age where I knew I wasn't going to be drafted, I quit graduate school before getting a PhD, and decided I got offered a job to edit a collection of film criticism. I was interested enough in film by a friend I knew, and that got me involved. I would say the main influences I had then and to this day, the ones that were probably the biggest influences, were, again, Andrew Saris, Manny Farber, who was very important as a writer, and the third was an influence then. I mean, he's not an influence, so much now, but the first book of Noel Birch, which I read in French, called Praxis du Cinéma in French and Theory of Film Practice in English. I think it's out of print now. But is a kind of it's a formalist study, I think you'd say, of film. And I used it because when I moved to Paris in 1969, and lived there for 5 years. And just as I had used Saris as a kind of guide to my viewing of what films I should see, I was using Praxis de Cinema in the same way, of looking up films that were in the index that he discussed and going to see those films usually at the Cinémathèque Française. So even though I was still writing novels when I moved to Paris, or I was working on what became my third novel, none of which I ever published, I found that I was being able to get my film criticism published, and I wasn't getting my fiction published. So so I stuck with it, and that's basically how I became a film critic.
Well, first of all, I'm French, so excuse my French, because, but you know, in France there is a famous quote, word of François Truffaut that say, the French have 2 jobs, their own and film critic. So, but I remember that when I was in a small town too, and I was a film lover. I saw a lot of films in VHS, at the cinema, the little theater that we have in my small town, and 2 things made my heart beat. I love to write, and I love to see movies, to see films. So one day I wrote on films, and by accident I became a film critic, maybe. So I remember that I read the Positif, I read the Cahiers du Cinéma, and that seems to me a very strange word and beautiful word that people can write on films and live with that. I remember that I bought a book of Serge Danet named Ciné Journal. I don't know if maybe it's translating in English. I don't know the
A lot
the
of
time.
Danet is not available.
There's a website, Serge Danet in English, which has some of the essays.
Okay. So, Ciné Journal was a book with the critics of Serge Danet that he wrote for Libération, for Cahiers du Cinéma, and that's one of the books that astounded me and made me a film critic. I'm not Serge Danet, but that's the way I want to, because Serge Danet has a very his own way to write. You know, he writes with his art, with his life, and life and films are mixed. So that's the way I love to speak of cinema.
Morning. My story is remarkably similar to Liam's. I always tell people I've been extremely lucky that my 2 big passions in life, movies and music, I've been able to indulge and get paid for it, which I know probably makes you very jealous, and for good reason. But the early 90s, I was the Star's rock critic, and there's a sort of unofficial thing at the Star where you go from being rock critic to movie critic. And never quite sure why that happened. I think it's because the editors never really paid that much attention, and that's just sort of the way it went. But I guess you had to prove yourself in rock before you were entitled to do movies. But I studied some movies. I took some movie courses at university, and I had sort of a bipolar thing. I would read guys like Jonathan and Andrew Sarris and Manny Farber, but for the more enthusiastic side of it would be Pauline Kael and Siskel and Ebert. I just, when the chance came up to take the movie beat, it was the year I turned 40. It was 1996. And I realized that even though I loved doing rock, that the job didn't open up very often, and that if I was going to do it, I had to make the jump. So, you know, it's been 15 years now, and it's been great. I mean, I've been very lucky, and if you can ever indulge a passion, then I highly recommend you to do it.
Okay, that's an interesting segue into the next question I have. It seems that there's actually more and more of these panels every year, and unfortunately, it seems more and more film critic jobs are being cut, or maybe being offered to pay less money. Word counts are constantly shrinking. On the other hand, though, society places a great importance in the film critic. They've recently, the Library of America has published the anthologies of Manny Farber and also Pauline Kael. So I was just wondering if I could get from each of you, how would you define the role of a film critic today?
Well, I guess beyond the conventional to entertain and instruct, what I'm interested in doing is providing a model for a way of reacting to movies, to encourage people to reflect and to encourage people, I think, to enhance their pleasure by negotiating it with the work of art and judging their own aesthetic and ethical responses to it at each stage. And I do my version of it, but it's really intended to encourage other people to do the same thing, which I hope will enhance their experience as it does mine.
Well, I'm very much in the same boat as Liam. I think the definition I like to give of film criticism, or film critic, is someone who assists in the discussion of film. And the discussion of film begins before the critic comes along, and it continues after the critic leaves. But if the critic is a good critic, the critic's able to, let's say, improve or shift the level of the discussion or the kind of discussion that goes on. I think that it's a very interesting period we're going through because, as Brad says, we're kind of like, on the one hand, a lot of people have lost their jobs. In my case, I was lucky because I willingly retired from the Reader when I did. But I mean, it was very shocking to just recently, Jim Hoberman and the Village Voice being let go. Or people said when someone wrote fired, they said, no, he was let go, but I haven't quite figured out what the difference is yet. But on the other hand, it seems to me that one thing that's contaminated the profession of film criticism is the control and pressure of advertising, the studios, and so on. And now that it's no longer so easy for people to make a living at it, this might even have beneficial effects, because it seems to me that there's, even though there's a whole spectrum from terrible to very good criticism on the internet, it's still a period when there's an awful lot of very sophisticated criticism appearing. And in fact, I would even argue that it's criticism, some of it on the internet, on a higher level than anything that had appeared in print magazines before, in one way or another. So I think it's, but I think part of the problem is that there are more choices now. There are more choices in film. There are more choices in film criticism. But if people are not already focused and they don't already know what they're looking for, it can seem much worse. If you know what you're looking for, it can seem much better.
Well, we have a special philosophy in Positive because we are all volunteers. So we got to have a job to live, and we write just for the love, pour l'amour de l'art, as we say in French, if you can understand. So it's a real pity that we see that, in fact, that the space for the real critics, for film critics, is shrinking on print newspapers, and everything when you look at the internet, you have blogs, you have everything that everyone give his opinion on what he saw just yesterday, and he saw. So it's a good thing because it's emulation, that we say in French. And years before we have a fanzine. I don't know if this is an English word, fanzine, that you can print your own newspaper, and that's that kind of thing that we find on the blog and everything. But I think that the role of the film critic is to be, as said Serge Danet, a passeur, a go-between, a boatman between your own passion and the way that you transform your passion in a language, in a way to think, and that's, I think, the good way to be a film critic, and it's we need it today. We need more than ever because there is too much films that you can have on internet, on everywhere. So we have to be. We don't have to be blind. You have to open the eyes of everybody, and that's the way I think it's the way I want to be a film critic.
I agree with what my friends here said, but I would add that I think the film critic's role now in these days, which is a very interesting time, is to also be a bit of a resistor, because there's this overwhelming effort, and I think we've all felt this, where to tie commerce to what we do, like that somehow that Mission Impossible 4 is a more important movie than, say, poetry, you know, the movie Poetry. And I think the film critic's role is within their own operation is to try to persuade their editor or persuade their readers even that there are other good films. I mean, like in Toronto now, we're blessed with the Lightbox here. So I make a real effort. It's a lot of extra work, but I make a real effort to promote the offerings of the Lightbox, because I think that the really good stuff, people will get a lot out of it. By appreciating what's happening here, they can also appreciate what's happening at the multiplex. You know, they can better improve some, you know, Mission Impossible. So I think that you have to. It can be a very depressing time if you only dwell at the number of film critic jobs that are lost and the sort of slide in income and things like that. But I also think you need to fight back. You know, if I could borrow somebody's phrase, it'd be like to kick against the darkness. Which you know, I think you just have to try to advance film.
Okay. And I guess, I mean, since we've talked about all these things can get lost with these blogs, is there anyone that you're reading today, or any blogs that you'd like to maybe share with our audience that you know they might not be aware of? Or
Mubi.com, that's a pretty good one. And I mean, there's a lot of great blogs. John, you have a blog, Jonathan, which is nice, a good blog. David Bordwell has a blog. You know, the more commercial ones is like Movie City News, covers the, you know, Ray Pride does a very good little news thing, which a lot of us end up on one way or the other. He's very thorough. You guys have any other?
Yes, Jonathan is very good, and my own is the best one. Well, no, but in France, maybe Bertrand Tavernier has a blog, you know, the director and film critic. Olivier Père, that you know, has a very good blog. And there is a collective blog named Vodcaster. I can give you the name later. It's like a micro-blogging blog, and it's very interesting because you have images, trailers, everything, and that's very passionate, and very young, so it's passionate for me.
I like Richard Brody too, in the New Yorker.
Oh yes, I think all the ones mentioned are important, and I'd mentioned before Serge Danet in English. Two critics in particular who I like quite a lot, who I go out of my way to read, are one who's very young, who recently had a brief career as a TV star, Ignaty Vishnevetsky, who has a blog called Direct Transmission. And I also like very much Chris Fujiwara,
Yeah.
who has a very good website, which recently became the director of the Edinburgh Film Festival. I think that there is. I also want to mention, in print, I think the best film magazine in English is a Canadian magazine, CinemaScope, in my opinion. Even though I write for it, I think even if I didn't write for it, I think I would feel this. And I think that the best, which is recently, I mean, is no longer existing, but what was the best in English on the internet was a magazine called Rouge, in my opinion. They've become suspended, but it's being kind of replaced by a new magazine that's only had one issue so far. That's called Lola Journal, I think. That comes out of Australia, but it's actually co-edited by someone in the United States who's Indian, actually, Girish Shambhu. And he, by the way, I would recommend very much his blog, Girish Shambhu, because he gives you links to all the other important ones, things that are going on. He really keeps up and is very good at that. He also has a presence on Facebook and Twitter. So I think he's a very good resource, because if you go to him, you'll find out about all the others, I think.
He's actually one of our regular patrons here, and for many years has been coming to the Cinematheque. He drives from Buffalo to come to screenings here. But I agree, his blog is amazing, and he does keep you up to date on everything else that's going on, too. And he's someone who also does not come from, he's not paid as a film critic. He's a professor. And
right, although I think he's starting to teach.
He is teaching a bit of film now.
I was going to say, though, the particular thing, just to clarify a little bit, one of the things I liked especially about Rouge, and is also true of Lola, which I think we don't have enough of, is that they specialize in, these are specializing in translation from other languages, because the weakest thing that I think about the supposed golden age of what some people regard as the golden age of film criticism is the 60s, was that except for French criticism being translated into English, there was very little translation going on in that period, and consequently, whole national cinemas that were very important, that we knew nothing about until Serge Danet introduced us to them, like, among others. I mean, Iranian cinema, Taiwanese cinema, for example, most of Chinese film, for example. So I think that one of the real importance of Rouge and now Lola and Serge Danet in English, all of these things, is translation, and I think that that's even though we have resources that get one a little bit like automatic translations, they still come out kind of as gibberish. I can remember translating once, I don't know, remember, it was I think something in Spanish about myself, and I discovered that in English it said that I was the film critic at a gratuitous newspaper in Chicago, the Chicago Reader. This is the kind of thing you get from automatic translation.
One other one is IndieWire.com. I'm sure most of you here know it. And it started actually about 15 years ago or so, and it was primarily American indie film, but it's grown over the years to become much more comprehensive. They do a very good job.
Okay. I suspect everyone on this panel at some point, or even currently, has worked for a publication where you have to attach a value rating to your review. How do you use, or how do you write a review where does it change the way you write your review when you have to attach that value rating? Would you write it differently if you didn't have to?
Why don't I start so it doesn't go like...
Sure, yeah.
How would I write with that? I mean, I think I'd probably write better, but I don't like the star rating system. It's unfortunate. I mean, it's become a crutch where people, and I do this myself, you see it and you go, well, that's a 1-star review and that's a 4-star review. It's just the way things are. Sort of, we live in this society now where we want to quantify everything, lists of 10, lists of 5. I think that has a lot to do with the rise of the internet. But it's sometimes you just wish, like for example, Rotten Tomatoes, the way they parse the readings is really interesting, because I'll write a 2.5 out of 4 means good in the stars rating system, and a 3 means very good, and 2 means fair. But I'll give a 2.5 star review to somebody, and they'll decide it's a Rotten Tomato. And I'm thinking, wonder how they got that. But I guess that's a bit of a compliment, because they've read the review and they've extracted their own. They've gone into my psyche and decided I really didn't like it after all. But I would prefer to have the system that the New York Times still has, and the New York Times is an absolute rarity, where they don't put the star ratings on. And I think they give the guys at Rotten Tomatoes a hard time, because they have to read the whole thing and figure out whether Tony Scott or Manola liked that film or not. But how do you guys feel? Do you like you all use star rating type thing as well, or?
When in positive we have very. You mean the question is when. I'm alone with my writing.
Well, for positive, I guess you probably don't use the star rating.
No, there's only the Conseil de 10, which is in the Cahiers du Cinéma, which they give stars there, but not with the reviews, just in terms of short listings. And I guess if you, during the Cannes Film Festival, they have newspapers that list star ratings very often.
But it's always one critic, one film critic. But we don't have that kind of stars or values.
The film français, are you in that list of Cannes?
No, I'm not in it.
That's very funny. Yeah. The film français in Cannes, they have this really funny rating system. One of them is pas de tout, and they have like a face with a frown, which
and the Palme d'Or.
Yeah, the Palme d'Or, à la folie, right? À la folie, like the Palme d'Ors. They're very extravagant ways of rating movies.
So we don't do that in positive, but maybe one day.
I don't think it affected too much the way I wrote about the films. I mean, I know that for a lot of people, it was used for people who didn't want to read. In other words, that's what it exists for largely, so they don't have to read you. And I think one of the reasons why I think part of the problem with that is that one can change one's mind. Although one of the main objections I would say I have to Pauline Kael, even though she influenced me when I was very young as a writer, not as a critic, but as a writer, is that she took the position that she only had to see a film once, and her opinion then was always going to be her opinion for the rest of her life. And there are just too many cases of films that are now my favorite film, among my favorite films, that I detested when I originally saw them. This was true of Tarkovsky's Stalker, for example. While I was watching it, I thought, this is so horrible. I'm just going to stay to the end to see how it turns out, but I can't stand it, and it's like, it's a very, very great film. And I think the point is that films that are great sometimes force you to change your habits. And it's precisely, and that's something that takes place over years. It doesn't take place within moments. Whereas I think the worst part of the atmosphere of the Cannes Film Festival is that there's an atmosphere in which everybody comes out of every film saying it's either terrible or it's wonderful. There's not even, it's okay. Nobody says it's okay. It's like there's this kind of, it's all about market driven. It's almost like, and which is, of course, the biggest problem. I mean, it's the difference between reviewing and criticism, which is reviewing is about assessing market value in a way, whereas it seems to me criticism is about something that goes beyond that and lasts longer and so on.
Yeah, I wouldn't be. I tend to view reviewing as tactics to criticism as strategy, more in that sense. I mean, it's the immediate. But regarding the star ratings, I used to sort of enjoy it. I remember Robert Christgau, who was the great pop critic at the Village Voice for years, would give letter grades. A-.
He also got laid off,
and they were, and it was a slightly impudent or mischievous kind of school teacherish thing to do. Talking about a Blue Cheer's third album or something, C-. And I used to think that was funny. But it's clearly consumer driven and advertising driven, and the worst of it is, for me, is that the editors and the managers are just look dull-eyed at a review that involves thought. I mean, between a rave and a pan, those are kind of easy, My colleague Rick Rohn used to say, we earn our paychecks on 2.5-star reviews. This is where the effort goes in, and testing it out. At the same time, within my own newspaper, it sort of became like a no-fly zone. You did a 2.5-star review, and editors would say, well, what do you really think? And you say, I really think this movie has some good parts and some not good parts. And it remains a struggle. I think every time they throw someone experimentally new on the beat for something like that for a while, they throw around a lot of 4 stars and 0s, which gets them attention. It's just not reality. It's just an easy way to make a noise. But I think the extreme of this is probably People magazine, where I believe they now have like a star, like a 1-paragraph review, a star rating, and in case that wasn't enough, bottom line, a 1-sentence summary of what you've just read about. How busy are people? Is my.
Can I tell them a funny story here, or what I think is a funny story? About a year ago, I was at the breakfast table with my daughter Emily, who's 19. She studies at U of T. She takes some film courses, and she said, "I thought you liked The Big Lebowski." And I said, "I do. I love it." She says, "Well, Wikipedia says you hate it." And I said, "What?" Some of you may have seen a column I wrote about this, but in January 1998, I was at the world premiere of The Big Lebowski, the Coen Brothers movie, and at Sundance. And I was fighting jet lag, and I made the classic mistake that I guess we all make at some point, where I was comparing it to the previous movie, which was Fargo. Love Fargo. It was my favorite movie in '96, and I didn't know how to take Big Lebowski. I liked it, but I was disappointed with it, and I guess my review obviously showed that. But somehow on Wikipedia it came out that I was the thundering denunciator of this movie, and I hadn't realized this. And my daughter said, "Well, they said you hate it." So I looked at it and I said, "Oh my God!" So what had happened actually was it was one of those cases, and I do this from time to time, where I had reevaluated the film when it opened, and I actually gave it a very high rating because I saw it again and I really appreciated it. It was like what Jonathan was saying, but somehow the reappraisal hadn't made it to Wikipedia. So I wrote this column about how strange it is to be accused of hating a movie like 15 years later when you're telling everybody you love it. I would rank it very highly amongst my favorite films. So I wrote a column, and then I noticed over the summer that Wikipedia had quietly changed the thing, and so whoever, I don't know who did it, I have to thank them, but they changed it and they put in my reappraisal, and so all is good now.
You can change Wikipedia yourself, you know.
And actually, I think one of the dangers of blogging is that one can blog more faster than one can think. And so it seems to me, I mean, I have regrets of, things that, you have an immediate knee-jerk reaction to a film and you write something very violent, say, if you opposed to it. Whereas if you thought about it a little longer, it's not that bad. There are other, and and you're also reacting to other critics and reviews too, which is, and in fact, that's something that's often not acknowledged, particularly because, some people read other reviews and some don't. But I mean, I think people are aware of other reviews even if they don't read them. And most of my colleagues tend to say, in fact, Hoberman just wrote this. One of his golden rules is you don't read the competition. Well, first of all, I don't see it as competition. So I differ with him in that way, although he's one of my favorite critics, certainly. But I feel that one has to learn from wherever and however one can. So I read critics even before I see the movie, everything. It's like I feel like there's no, even though people say, well, they might give away the plot, and there's spoilers and all of that, I think that's less significant than other things that one can learn. Because I think the most important value in criticism, which doesn't factor in the stars and the grades at all, is information. Information is the single most important thing. And the information has nothing to do with ratings.
That reminds me, when you talk about Cannes, when what you need to know when you're in Cannes, film critics, that the first day everything is good. You can think, you can... But after that, you have the parties, and the fourth day, you have a wide bunch of zombies, that just fight for nothing. And after Cannes, you have to see again the movie that you get to say that you gave the Palme d'Or, or just because you have to be more in. I don't find the word, but. But that's a circus, and that's very, very fine. So, but in Positive, we are not a newspaper quotidien. We can think, and we wrote on the film 2 weeks after Cannes. So it's better for us because you can revalue your judgments. So
I just bought a book last night that I'm reading that's fascinating, by the way, that deals with this about Cannes, because it's a kind of autobiography by Jules Jacob about... Yeah, and that's right. And what's fascinating about it was like going into all the kind of behind-the-scenes stories about what got the Palme d'Or and why and who was fighting for which and even why sometimes the results of, like critics' organizations are very misleading. For example, I can remember the year that Out of Sight was called the best film by the National Society of Film Critics when I was a member. Why did that happen? Because there was a kind of I'm trying to remember the two films. There was, it was basically a Saving Private Ryan, and there was
Shakespeare in Love?
No, it wasn't Shakespeare in Love, but there were two films that were running neck and neck, and that had almost opposite reactions to war films. I mean, I can't remember
war films, sorry.
What.
Sorry, go on.
But in any case, because it was a kind of tie, it was broken by voting for Out of Sight, which was not anybody's favorite film, but it nevertheless became the Thin Red Line. That's right, The Thin Red Line versus Saving Private Ryan. That's right. And so I think that these things people put much too much importance on them. And the reason why they put so much importance on them is the same reason why they put too much importance on the Oscars. This is all industry-driven. The industry is so eager to get these things that, even though I'm not a professional critic at all and I don't review, I get floods of screeners at the end of every year. And so even though I feel the great luxury of my life is I don't have to see, some of the films that reviewers have to see now. Like,
I have to go see Underworld Awakening after this.
Yeah. But the point is I still have the option for many of them because they send me the screeners. And this is all so they can use them in ads. I mean, in terms of like Oscar. And, you know, it's also even propaganda. I mean, the idea of Oscars is that to present this fantasy view of the industry in which everybody loves everybody else and is nice to everybody else and recognizes the genius of everyone else, when in fact it's everybody's knifing everybody else in the back. So these are public relations gestures that become, in the public mind, critical positions, which I think is really unfortunate.
Just a few words on, you told that what it's important in a review or in a paper, it's the information. And I think that the role of a real film critic is to be a memory of cinema. You know, you have to keep that kind of information, but also to tell not what is good and what is wrong, but you've got to have a memory of cinema, of what, and that's important for me. That's what I don't find on every blogs or every, but yes, I think that's.
Yes, but I think even though you don't find it on some of them, one of the things that amazes me about the better younger critics is that today it's more possible to know the history of cinema without living in Paris or New York. It used to be that in order to, that's why I lived in Paris and New York, is because you couldn't really discover the history of cinema unless you lived in those places. Whereas now you can live anywhere in the world, and some of the most sophisticated critics I know live in very rural areas, but they order DVDs. And through that, all kinds of things become accessible that were not accessible before.
But that's the question of hierarchy. I don't know the word. You know, between I don't know, art film and commercial movies, and young people. I'm not old as I am Dorian Gray. You know. So I knew the cinema from the beginning, and just to say that I met very young people, students, everything that are maybe they know all of the giallo, you know, all of the giallo, the Italian movie, but they don't know Dreyer, they don't know even. It's fantastic to have everything is here, but you don't. Everything is on the same level, you know.
Well, absolutely.
That's great.
Because there are even, in fact, one could even say when I'm most depressed, that bad movies are more popular than good movies, because there are actually more magazines and blogs devoted to bad movies, things that are acknowledged as bad movies, than to good movies. And that gets, of course, very depressing. And no, you're absolutely right. But I think but on the other hand, I think that there's more space for more specialized. For instance, when I was first getting acquainted with film in the 60s, it was impossible for me, because I hadn't been to Paris yet, to see a good print of any Carl Dreyer film. And I didn't even like Day of Wrath, because I only saw lousy 16mm prints. And, you know, it was like I wasn't seeing the films. And now you can get, there's even the first Blu-ray of Dreyer that just come out from Denmark. So the point is that it's now possible to see them all as they should be seen, even though if it's not always on film, it's still better than one could see them before. So that there's an opportunity that is presented that was not there before.
Okay, I think at this point, maybe we'd like to open up to the audience for some questions. So if you raise your hand, we're going to pass a mic to you. So if you can just wait. We'll start back here. If you can.
Thanks. Do you guys feel that there's I mean, people often talk about criticism as if it was like an entirely subjective process. But do you feel that that's entirely the case, or whether there's an actual objectivity in your opinions, whether it's kind of an objective process?
I'll just quickly say, I think the single most important thing of a critic is to be honest, to give an honest opinion, because I think if you're writing because you think it should be a certain way, or because you're afraid of somebody criticizing you, then I think you're really failing the reader and yourself. I mean, it has to. Hopefully, it comes from a base of knowledge and from some real appreciation and good taste. But also, it's just you have to really say what you honestly feel about the film.
No, I agree. In fact, I think that is the only viable definition of objectivity, putting the subjectivity, because subjectivity is the only kind of, but the point is one has to be honest about one's subjectivity, and once one is, that objectifies it. I think that, it almost comes down to religious beliefs. If you believe in God, then you believe in objectivity, because objectivity is God's point of view. If you don't believe in God, you don't, I mean, but the point is God is not a film critic, so it seems to me that we do not, the whole idea that you can get something called objectivity in a film review is absurd. I think the point is you have to know, I have been criticized in my own writing for being too subjective and too personal. But the point is, my point about that is that I think you have to know where the opinions are coming from and where the critic is coming from. And the more you can do to inform the reader of that, the better equipped the reader is to evaluate, because the reader doesn't have to agree with you. It's one of the most interesting things ever said to me about was when I once had an interview with Jean-Luc Godard. He said, "I want to be considered like an airplane, not like an airport." So that, in other words, people, and so I was thinking as a critic like that people get on you like a plane to go where they want to go, not where you want to go, and then they get off. So they don't have to have the same destination that you have.
Jonathan, I was going to ask you, how far would you take that? Because the type of writing I don't particularly like is the one where the guy tells me what he had for breakfast, that he broke up with his girlfriend. There's a...
Well, that can or cannot be relevant to the review. I mean, I think it all depends on whether it's relevant or not. If it's not relevant, it's static. It sort of gets in the way. But on the other hand, I think it all comes down to individual cases. I think it's sure there's very self-indulgent kind of stuff, which and I maybe even have been guilty of that too. I mean, I think the important thing is equipping the reader with a kind of a way to work out another itinerary, basically.
I used to fret a lot about those issues, but they don't really mean much to me anymore about subjective, objective. I think a piece of writing is a performance, and the quality. If you can fake sincerity, that idea you got it made. And the first time it struck me actually was we used to have a rule against using the first person in any reviews, and first time I did it. It felt sort of indecent and a bit strange, but at the same time, I suddenly realized that capital I is actually not me. It's someone I've just put out there, and I could tell you a lie. I could tell you something about I was feeling that I wasn't feeling, and then it's quite clear to me that any piece of writing is a performance, and you have to judge the quality of that performance as a reader.
Liam, didn't J. Scott used to do first person a lot?
In dashes and in brackets and in asides and in digressions, yes. I mean, he had a way of...
There wasn't like a Globe edict against it? It was just sort of frowned upon, or
it was frowned upon, but it would be done in a you see it in Anthony Lane. Here's my stylish little aside, and you sort of think, I think that feels more like P.G. Wodehouse than you, but I'll buy that it's what you're telling me is your real opinion. You can clearly see it's kind of a writing technique.
Well, yes, and I think most editors don't, discourage the idea of using I a lot. I mean, what happened to me, which was kind of unusual, is that I wrote my first book is an autobiography, which was not a work of film criticism, but was an attempt to get myself out of film criticism even, but which was trying to deal with my life and relationship to film, but not so much in a critical way, because the films I was dealing with were ones that had no critical status. They were just important to me when I was 10 years old because I saw them then. And so it had to be using I. But then, because I found I couldn't make a living doing anything as a literary writer, I had to be a film critic. But then I discovered from that it was like there's a kind of, that you can learn about yourself from being autobiographical. But again, you have to learn something. If it's just simply stating something, in other words, it can obviously be exhibitionism, and that's always a problem. But I found that it was a struggle I had during my 20 years at the Chicago Reader, that I felt I had to give an explanation of how my opinions got formed. And then the only way I could do that was autobiography, was to talk about the steps I'd gone through to arrive at that. Not because they were the steps that anybody else needed to go through at all. On the contrary, it was to liberate other people so they could work out their own agendas by knowing what of mine could be attributed to my agendas and what to mine they could extract from it for use for other kinds of uses. So I think that there is an objective reason for using it, but you have to be very careful in how you use it. And one of the things I admired most in J. Scott, because I have his 2 books, are precisely the way he used it, his personal things, actually.
There's a quote of Goethe's about he has 2 3-question things. One's related to criticism, but this is the not, which is that the questions you have to ask yourself is, what is the history of mankind? What is this? What is the history of mankind? What is the story of your time, and what is just the story of yourself? And in each of those, you try to be aware of that in your writing.
There's a particular burden about being a Canadian film critic, in that younger people come to you, like several times a year. People will come and they'll say, "So every critic since J. Scott has really sucked. Why is that?" And they'll be like somebody who's 20 years old, like, "Hey, what was it you really liked about J. Scott, who's been dead about 25 years now?" Something like that.
I don't. The fact that interests me about Jay in a way is he wrote as well about food as he did about film. I mean, it was a writing ability.
Well, actually, he wrote a review of a Leonard Cohen concert, I think the week he died, actually, which I was at the same concert. His review was way better than mine. I thought, man, this guy's on his deathbed, and he's doing a better review of Leonard Cohen than I am. It was like...
The other, I wanted to mention the good thing. The other thing was a famous quote of his about criticism. Is he said the 3 questions you should ask are, what is the artist trying to do? Is it successful, and does it matter? I think, kind of in contemporary times, we'd probably be less interested in what the intention of the artist, because in many cases we don't know the intention and we have no access to it. But just for me, those 3 questions are still interesting. The first question is, what is it that I'm dealing with? The second question is, how does it work? And the third question is, does it matter?
Yeah, well, I think whenever you say something is good, you have to follow it up with good for what?
To that question of objectivity and subjectivity, I think that there is a difference between subjectivity and to give a simple opinion. I read Kierkegaard to be very smart. I think that I read Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, writer, and he said that subjectivity is the truth. And I think that when you write, the technique writing is to go, is to know, d'aller au bout de la subjectivité. I don't know how to go over your subjectivity. Is not just to tell Fabien Gaffé, I have the knowledge of everything. But you have to explain what you understand of the movie, and to go. The danger is when the film critic is more important than the film that is talking about. We're talking about influence. One of the best books of cinema, I think, in French, is the Dictionary of Cinema, le Dictionnaire du Cinéma of Jacques Lourcel. I don't know if you know. Yeah, it's a kind of subjectivity work, but it's fascinating. The writing, the memory of cinema, the knowledge is everything is here, and that's I want to read from a film critic or an historian of cinema. And there is 2 kind of technical writing. When I'm writing on Twitter, on a blog, it's more personal, more a fiction. It's a game. You say and you write I, but it's a fictional I. And when I wrote for positive, it's not more serious, but it's more objective. I want to give the reader all the tools in terms of history of cinema, in terms of of what the director want to do extra, and not just to give an opinion to say it's good, it's bad, but to, well, that's the way.
I grew up in an era where when film criticism actually set cultural agendas.
Oh, there.
Over here.
Yeah, in the dark. It's Pierce.
Can you see me now? I grew up in an era when film criticism actually set cultural agendas. And you've referred to many of the critics, Pauline Kael, et cetera, et cetera. We read them, and they were read by many, many, many people. I think that time has changed enormously, and there's been a democratization of opinion. I think there's been a challenging of the authority of a critic. And I'm just wondering if you see this as an inevitable, or if you see that there's the opportunity for those agendas to still be set by critics, if indeed the golden era has passed, or is it just the failure of something in the medium itself or in the ideas themselves that has actually languished as film criticism has fragmented, opinion has fragmented. Is there ever an ability anymore for a few select people to set these key types of critical agendas?
Oh, I think it's an improved situation for me, because I think that it's one of the things is that the time frame is very different. For me, the archetypal experience of seeing an exciting film in the 60s is you would see a film, and then 2 months later you would meet somebody else who saw it. And then 3 months after, or 4 months later, you would read about it in Sight and Sound. Now it's instantaneous. And because of that, I mean, I'll tell you what I can use as the index of the change. In the 60s, Bresson, even by people who admired him, was a joke, was considered a joke. People used to sort of like smile when his name came up. He is like revered in a way now that he was not revered in the 60s, even by people who liked him. And you know, you can think of extremely difficult filmmakers like Pedro Costa, for example. People say Pedro Costa is neglected. Well, maybe he is, but on the other hand, there have been retrospectives devoted to Pedro Costa probably at 20 different places around the world now. And whereas if this were the 60s, none of us would have ever heard of Pedro Costa, probably. So I think it's a very different kind of cultural situation to begin with because of the internet. And agendas are being set every day on the internet, I think. I mean, for good and for bad, you know, it's like, but I think there's certainly all kinds of ways in which fashion and it's just that it all happens much more quickly. It doesn't have to take months for things to happen.
I just want to. I think what you say is absolutely right in the sense that when I was in university in the 70s, there used to be one copy of the New Yorker that came to our little library reading room in the Carleton University's journalism school, and we'd all fight each other to see who could read Pauline Kael's review. So I think that day has definitely passed, where you have that kind of total focus on one critic and where you go from there. But I'll give you a real left field example of thinking. There used to be the leader of the United Auto Workers was a guy named Walter Reuther, who was considered to be very forward-thinking for a guy, like a blue-collar guy. And he was actually embraced automation in the auto industry because he saw it not as taking away jobs, but as making jobs safer for employees, like the paint spraying and stuff that was dangerous to employees would go to robots. And he was in favor of that. They used to say about Reuther that he would get nostalgic about the future. And that's how I think we're at an exciting time in the sense that there's so many interesting things happening with the internet and with online and digital film that we should be nostalgic for the future as well. Like, where is this going to be 5 and 10 years from now? It is an exciting time. So even though it is also fearful in terms of jobs and maybe the sense of feeling that there's all these voices out there competing with you, it's also a very hopeful time.
Yeah, I think even the way you describe that is people sort of setting the cultural agenda. I mean, it's partly this business that, you know, the withholding of information is power, and if you were waiting for, you know, the critic to bring the tablets down from the mountain, then you sort of had to accept them. But now we've got, you know, Google Earth and several aerial views. I mean, we just don't need authority is eradicated, and I think that's mostly a positive thing. You know, before I certainly remember being stuck with the hometown critics and having to read them, or if you went out of your way, you could buy out-of-town papers and the rest of it. Now, everybody who's writing about film pretty much is instantly available, and you can measure them. You can decide who's any good, who isn't. You don't have to be stuck with, in some town, reading one bad paper. And I think the opening up of information is amazing. I also think the same thing is if someone says, well, if you haven't seen so-and-so, you really don't know what you're talking about. You say, screw that. I'll go see them. I can see it. You can. It's very empowering on a large level. I like it a lot.
I like to think that one of the main radical changes that we're still adjusting to about the internet is the whole sense of place. I think it's really interesting that the editor of CinemaScope lives in Austria. The editor of Film Quarterly, an American magazine, lives in London. We don't know where people are when they post on the internet. And we're so much in the habit of thinking of whether a film succeeds or fails as how many people in your neighborhood go to see it, when in a way that's maybe relevant to the way that the rights are owned by certain people in different territories. But it seems to me that, for example, when people talk about, let's say, people who are considered minority, like Pedro Costa or Kiarostami, it seems to me that the way to judge their impact is globally, not in terms of your own neighborhood, because the community, at least the community that I feel I'm a member of, is global now. And so it seems to me that this has not yet been translated adequately into political terms, because once it really does become a really political question of how people can organize on the internet, the individual countries are really, there for the convenience of marketers. I mean, they're markets. But in other respects, the communities are not defined by the countries. And I think people tend to make them equivalents of each other when they don't need to be.
Well,
Except for language, of course. I mean, that obviously is a restriction.
But to talk about the global information, and too much information is like oblivion. You have to. It's all a question of time, and that's why I said that the film critic has to be the keeper of a certain way to live with time, and because the truth is that a film is released, and 1 week or 2 weeks after that, everything is the times they are changing, and but I think that internet is that before that when you were a film critic, you were like a doctor, or you have the rightness, the authority to tell, and you have to gain trust of the reader. That's the challenge now. It's for a few film critics of a lot of film critics to have the trust of the reader, and when he read you or the magazine, it has, yes, that magazine is the way I'm sure that I read something true and honest. That's the way we have to battle. That Philippe Solers, a French writer, he don't like cinema at all, but he wrote a book that was The War of Taste. That the taste is a war, so you have to be a warrior in that kind of.
Yeah, and I guess it's less of a fortress mentality. I mean, you have to be mobile. That's fine.
Okay, in the back here.
And I just wanted to mention, I've heard about the language barrier and then also the internet, and I wanted to just point out to the audience and also to you that there's a website that's from the Film Studies Association of Canada called the Permanent Seminar on the Histories and Theories of Cinema, and they take any text that you would like translated, and they get a curator or scholar, graduate student to translate any text, primary text and criticism from 1895, and I think they're cutting it to maybe 1990s right now. So it's like a very broad spectrum from anywhere in the world.
What's the URL?
It's the Permanent Histories and Theories of Cinema. I will look it up. But if you go from the Film Studies Association of Canada, so FSAC, it will link you right there. But they're getting all kinds of film scholars and art historians and everyone who has a clear grasp on the subject and the language to create the text. And then they put the PDF of the original text right beside the translation so that you can have both.
That's wonderful.
Hello, I just wanted to thank you guys, firstly, for coming and talking to us all. I'm sure I speak for a few other people in the room here, like aspiring film critics who are a little bit, timid about getting into this industry that everyone kind of is already saying is in decline, I guess, or in ruins, but you're providing a lot of optimism, so thank you first and foremost. My question really is just, I know personally for myself, a lot of the critics I read are male. I don't know if that's just me, but I was wondering for you guys if you have anyone contemporary, any female contemporary critics that you guys enjoy reading or hearing from.
Manola Dargis from New York
Manola
Times.
Dargis, Melissa Anderson, Katrina Longsworth.
I think Nicole Brenet is a major figure for me. Who's French?
She's not a film critic. She's not really a film critic. She's not.
Well, she writes. She's written a lot. She's published a lot of film criticism. However, there's even a book of hers on Abel Ferrara in English, for example, and I think she's been very influential. Her students and so on. She's an academic, but I consider her very. Even though she doesn't write reviews in the usual sense, I do consider her a critic and a very important one, actually.
In the past, one of the people I didn't mention was Susan Sontag, who I think was tremendously important to read.
Yeah, she was a big influence on me too, actually, in fact, I would say. I think it's true that there's, sometimes it's been talked about that there's a certain kind of collector's mentality that's somehow associated with being male. But I think it depends. For example, one blog that hasn't been mentioned but is a very good one to go to is Dave Kerr's blog. And there's a Japanese woman who contributes, who I think is based in Japan, who writes in English, and who gives a Japanese point of view, a Japanese woman's point of view on all these issues that come up. And it's really interesting. But it's true that, I would say out of the 30 or 40 main contributors to this blog, only maybe 3 are women, so it is unfortunate, and I think it's another person I think who's become more and more prominent, who's very good, is a woman who describes herself as a self-styled siren, who has a blog that's a very good one, actually, and there are a lot of links to her from for example, Some Came Running, that's done by Glenn Kenny, for example, but she's someone who I think is becoming very important, actually, within that universe.
I think one of the problems is that the internet, the bad side of the internet, it has this kind of mob mentality, which I think if you're a female writing on the internet, you're subject to a different kind of attack. Like I'll see a lot of really, really nasty sort of sexually oriented attacks that men don't get, and I think. I'm not a woman, so I can't speak for this, but I have to think that a lot of women might find this intimidating, and I think it's a bad thing that I wish we could remove from the internet. Where I'm not a fan of anonymous comments at all. I think they're awful. If you really have something to say, then say it, and it doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree, but don't be a coward. And I think that's one of the things that conspires against more women having a voice, because there's just this really nasty. I don't know if you guys agree with that, but.
The situation with women writing in film, I think, is better than it was. I think there's more women getting into it. It's probably like chefs. It's one of those areas that has been male dominated, but is shifting.
Yeah, I saw recently the woman you called the self-styled siren. I've seen her. There was an attack upon her. A bunch of guys ganged up on her over something. I can't remember what it was, but it was just like last week or so.
I didn't see that, but it is true that there's a certain kind of. Well, she was very objecting to the way that certain people were writing about Pauline Kael, and saying that they wouldn't, if Pauline Kael was a man, they wouldn't have written about her in that way. And it is true that there are, all kinds of sexual attitudes that get inscribed, sort of like in this discourse. And yes, I agree with you that anonymous blogging is something that creates a lot of very ugly consequences. There used to be, not written to me, but to the reader, anti-Semitic diatribes written every week practically. But were all directed at me. Who would sort of like saying, well, of course, since Rosenbaum's Jewish, I'm sure that he must be, like Zionist and so on. And, I wrote back and I said, on the contrary, the reason why I'm not a Zionist is because so many people who are so full of hatred like you are. What I'm saying is that there's an awful lot of people who, and I think one of the unfortunate things about culture, and this is not just North American, but all over the world, it seems, is people tend to gravitate towards websites and blogs that agree with them. And so they don't encounter contrary points of view. And so as a consequence, people who already have certain biases get even more biased. So, and this gets reflected in all kinds of ways. Astonishing things that get said, like in the recent Republican debates, I don't know, it wasn't during the debates, but I think Rick Santorum actually said, Europeans don't have a reason to live now. Just imagine, things like this that I think wouldn't have even been conceivable during the Cold War, that people wouldn't have. I don't think people, even then, the most rabid anti-communists would say Russians don't have any reason to live. It's just astonishing that people who are considered mainstream figures can say things like this now. And I think that's because people are becoming more clannish because they kind of like gravitate just to the news shows and the blogs that already agree with them. And so they don't get exposed to other points of view. And so there's less of a dialogue in that sense.
That would lead to the kind of thing where, when The Dark Knight came out, and I think it was David Edelstein ruined the 100% rating and suddenly received rashes of death threats. You say, it's a movie, you can still see it. What I like about anonymous comment sections is they've robbed me of my dearly held delusion that I'm my own worst critic.
We have back here in the dark.
Do you guys think that writing about acting in film criticism has become de-emphasized or devalued? When you talk about someone like Pauline Kael, she would, possibly because she had more space, she was really, really interested in acting, sometimes to the expense of film form or film aesthetics. Then you have a generation of critics coming up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s who are more enthralled to auteurism and issues of maybe national cinema thematics, things that come up in university courses. I know a lot of critics feel that they either lack the language or the authority to discuss acting. It becomes kind of a side topic. And even when you guys have been discussing film here, it's always in terms of directors. It is part of the critic's job. I'm just wondering if you guys think it's become less of a big part of the critic's job.
I don't know that if it's ever been maybe as prominent as it should be. I actually would cite other people, like Manny Farber has been very good in writing about actors, and an academic critic who's written a very good book on acting and is very good is James Nairmore. But I think part of the problem is having the right kind of like technical equipment, and it's a very tricky thing. And of course, Kael was best at when she wrote about acting, but Farber can be really good about it too, it seems to me. Within the tradition of, and in fact within English criticism, a very neglected figure who's very important, Raymond Durgnat, was very good about acting too. But I can't think of, well, there's a book by Luc Mollet called Politique des Acteurs.
Politique des Acteurs.
Yeah, which is, but it only deals with 4 figures, yes. But that's a step in the right. And of course, there's an important book by a sociologist, Les Étoiles, the Stars, by
yes, Edgar Morin. But I'm very happy that you asked that question because you talked to the right man. in fact, with some friends, we have a group in university that called Groupe de recherche de réflexion sur l'acteur de cinéma. In French, it's a group to talk about acting in film criticism or in university. I'm with Christian Viviani, Christophe Damour, and Vincent Amiel, and we, from 5 years by now, we want to talk about the acting, and it's yes, it's the most difficult thing to do. You know, we have a collection of books. I wrote Johnny Depp, but it's not in terms of biography of everything of star studies. It's just to know. Is an actor can be an author. I think there is but in terms of gesture, of themes, so it's a very interesting way to talk about movies and to go beyond the politique des auteurs, you know, yes, it's a very interesting thing. Yeah.
I have. I think that what happens is that people who drift into film criticism are, you know, we're word people. It's logocentric, first of all. The first thing people attach to a lot is story, narrative. That's easy to write about. And I think that the next area where many film critics are weak is on the visual side. That is something that they may catch up with slowly. And acting is down at the bottom often. And I've worked really hard to try to understand acting whenever I have interviews with actors. But the one thing that keeps coming back to me, particularly in the North American context, is you're often dealing with people with, in the same film, with 8 different backgrounds, with 8 different kinds of schooling. There's people out of theater, there's people out of modeling, there's people out of television acting, there's people out of... the director may have organized them into a whole, or not. When I used to write about theater, our line always was that if everybody's good, it's the director. If everybody's bad, it's the director. If it's mixed, you don't know. I mean, it's and so it's very difficult without seeing a lot of the same people's work in different contexts to start to really assess what they are doing. And it also it's filled with those indeterminates of just physicality, of voice, and the kind of sort of understudied science of gesture. So I think it's just more complicated than saying really Scott's exciting or something.
I think it's very hard and maybe shouldn't be always considered of as often is in isolation, because to me one of the most interesting things that was ever said to me about Chaplin was by Jean-Marie Straub, who said that Charlie Chaplin was the greatest editor in the history of cinema because he knew exactly when a gesture began and when a gesture ended. And so that automatically becomes connected to acting to editing. And some of the most important figures in cinema are writer, director, actors, and the writing is often neglected. I mean, people do not talk about Erich von Stroheim as a writer, but he was, to me, his writing was absolutely central to both his performance and his directing. The same is true of Elaine May and Albert Brooks, and not to mention Chaplin. You know, so it seems to me that it's tied to other things. In other words, part of the problem too is that I think criticism got mired in the concept of mise en scène, when there's a great French term, which there's no equivalent for in English, called découpage, which takes in more than mise en scène, actually, I think. It's almost like a very, this is not exactly right, but you could say découpage is closer to being mise en scène plus editing, in a way. But in any case, it seems to me that the whole idea that the art of cinema is mise en scène is limiting.
I just want to add to that, I think sometimes from the academic approach, it's a little bit too structuralist, and it sort of discounts the value of acting. My daughter was taking this course, and she was told to study this very early Harold Lloyd film, and I was astonished that the instructions that the professor had said, do not comment on the plot and do not comment on the acting in any way. Like, they were specifically told not to refer to that. I thought, Harold Lloyd? But I think also too, as a critic, sometimes the thing that I think that you're fighting against is that you basically have 20 inches, 25 inches in a newspaper, And you really can't list every single acting performance. And sometimes I think we overemphasize what the director does because, the director has a cinematography, he's a second unit director or even a third unit director. It's sometimes hard to know exactly what the director did, but it's always a balancing act. In my case, I try to show if I think it's a singular work of acting, I try to point that out. And
but acting is part of mise en scène, of course. So you know that everybody knows that. For the example of Marlon Brando, you know that Brando has a huge influence of Elia Kazan mise en scène because his new way of acting with his entire body. You have less close-up, less thing, and the camera has to follow the gesture, and that's what it's interesting to study what is acting and mise en scène. For me, of course, cinema is mise en scène, but it's not just a god who is looking some insects. You know, there is ouais, yes, voilà. C'est plus facile en français pour moi, mais voilà. Interactivity, if you want, but it's more than interactivity. You know, it's when yes, okay.
Okay,
I'm a bad actor.
question. It's just over here.
Hi. Yeah. I'm a film blogger, so it's cool to hear you guys talk about this stuff. I have a website, Toronto Film Review. I'm really interested in youth, so modern audiences, so taste, and film history. And the one film magazine I really like to read is Cahiers du Cinéma. These guys here would do reviews of Mission Impossible 4 and a new Twilight movie and say these are really great. And movies like Le Havre and Bellatar's A Turn Horse, they'll easily dismiss. I was just wondering, what do you guys think about that magazine and the idea of, youth and film criticism?
You say youth? I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, I don't know, but in terms of... it's a very broad subject. I think it's easier to talk about something narrower within that because it's almost like too much of a generality to say youth and film criticism because, I mean, when you teach, you have good students, you have bad students, and they're all youthful. I mean, it's like, I think it's very hard to, I find it very hard to generalize. There are too many different types of people within that category.
Are you saying that the young people, prefer Mission Impossible 4 over, Bellatar? Is that what you're saying, or?
Yeah, exactly.
I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, I'm astonished a lot of times by some of the email I get, and people they'll be raving about a Bellatar type movie, the Turan Horse, and they'll be saying how dare I give a good review to Mission Impossible, which I actually like the fourth one. It's funny how you get in. I didn't like the fourth Mission. I love the fourth Mission Impossible, but didn't like number 2. Or I like Harry Potter number 3, but not number 8. It's this weird number situation we're in now. I think it's very hard to generalize. I mean, you can be a very astute 20-year-old and a very dumb 60-year-old. It just.
Well, I think it's also important to point out that there are thousands of times more money spent on promoting Mission Impossible than on the Bellatar film. I mean, it's completely unequal. It's not like it's a level playing field. Most people in North America have never heard of Bellatar because and the reason why millions of people in North America know about Mission Impossible is because millions of dollars are spent making sure that you know about it and are inundated with it. And that's why, for me as a critic, the great luxury I have now that I'm not writing for the Chicago Reader is I don't have to see Mission Impossible anymore. I don't feel I'm missing anything.
I think there's other things. There's sociability. If you were to look at the average, the box office is dominated by people sort of 11 to 28, and with people who are going out. People I remember somebody from the late famous Players Theater saying our core audience is gangs of 14-year-old girls looking for what to do on a Saturday afternoon. And that clearly drives the box office and how it's shaped, and I think that's fine. And for this particular place, the TIFF, the demographic is over 40, tends to be from uptown, tends to be somewhat more female than male, things like that. It would be different for the Bell Lightbox, which is a bit during the rest of the year, which would be a different meal. So there's different niches, but I had the good luck to go to Poland a couple of years ago to a festival, and there were a very a challenging festival of lots of different kinds of stuff. Lineups of 20-year-olds. I mean, it just sort of depends on the place and the expectations. College towns always have much different, better audiences than, or more adventurous audiences than other places. And yeah, definitely what they're marketed to. But I got nothing against people. I like people going out in gangs and watching popcorn movies. If that's what they want to do, it's how you meet people, how you hang out, how you form friendships. And it's going to, the Turin Horse, you probably aren't going to get 80 of your buddies to come along. And it's a different kind of activity.
For whatever
they also keep us employed.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, when I saw the Turin Horse last summer, I saw it 3 times in a film festival in Poland, and all three showings were packed, and I would say 85 to 90% of the audience were 25 and under.
What's with these young Poles? They're amazing.
But I'm sure that's, I don't think it's just necessarily a reflection on Poland. I think it's probably true other places too. But on the other hand, it's obvious. I mean, this is a very strange, because this is a kind of very bleak, uncompromising film that has no stars, that has no, production value. I mean, all these kind of things that people are supposed to want to go to movies for. So it's kind of extraordinary that people, are still finding something there. And it's a film that has gotten distribution, and where a lot of his other films haven't, and so on. So I think it's I think an awful lot of what people go to films for depends on what they've heard of and what their friends are talking about. But I'm saying that that's partly culturally determined. It's not a spontaneous thing that comes out of simply because everybody's taste is formed by what they think their choices are. And most of the films that I'm interested in are not even in those choices. It's like they don't consider that one of the options because they don't hear about them. They go to different blogs than I do.
So maybe just a few words before. The situation is maybe less different in Europe or in France, in fact. But I remember that Antoine Debec in Cahiers du Cinéma 10 years ago wrote a paper named La politique des films, films politique, not politique des auteurs, but politique des films. And I think my way to see movies is I don't like very much politique des auteurs. Like I say, just it was a strategy, in the war. It was good at the time, but now I don't like when you say that Alibaba is from Becker is better than a film by René Clair because it's Jacques Becker. I think that Mission Impossible 4, I didn't see that one, but is interesting, and Bellatar is interesting. The question is not to tell that this one is better than the other, and we have the right to tell that a film of Terence Fisher maybe is better than a film of Jean-Luc Godard, and in that kind of film de genre is always push, yes, whatever. It's garbage, but I think that Fisher is often more interesting than the late Godard. It's for you. It's just for discussion. I'm Godard. I'm maybe it's not a god, but. Just to say that a film, you have to say a thing about a film, one film, not because you have to have memory, extra, but judge the film. Not it's not good because it's a Godard film, because it's a Truffaut film, because it's a Michael Bay film. No, excuse me, it's not possible. But you know what I mean.
I agree with you, and believe it or not, there are Godard films I detest. Like such as Forever Mozart. I think his videos are much better than his films now, but generally. But so no, you're absolutely right, and I think it's. And I'm sorry to say that I don't know Terence Fisher's films very well.
But the Politique des auteurs was good in the 50s and the 60s because they have to tell that Hitchcock or Fritz Lang are great artists, great actors. But today we know that Hitchcock is a great artist, extra. I don't know if that's hate love can be blind, today. So it's hate and love can be both blind. So it's difficult to, yes, that's our job.
I like seeing defenses of CinemaScope. Brent, I can't remember who wrote about the Expendables, for example. I'm very interested in seeing popular films that are exuberantly defended. It's highly useful, and it's partly what I was talking about earlier. I mean, I just think everyone in their experience benefits from thinking about it, and it doesn't really matter what the type of film it is.
But you talk about the youth, and I think that when you are writing on cinema, and you are remembering all the films that mark you, it's a question of justify the time when you were youth, a young man. I think it's and that's the beauty of that. Well, I love John Hughes movies, so it's just because I buy a DVD here, and I'm the happiest man in the world.
But do you think the Politique des auteurs is also helpful in helping recognize these under-recognized filmmakers like a Pedro Costa, in a way today? It helps. How else would you see, like, In Vonda's Room on its own? It's hard to bring attention to a movie like that. So bringing the body of work in these retrospectives and talking about it as a body is also maybe still a valid way of looking at.
Well, even to the extent, I would even go further and say that Pedro Costa has helped my appreciation of Jacques Tourneur. Because, I mean, even though he doesn't not normally considered a critic, I think both his statements and his films show appreciations and understandings of Jacques Tourneur that are as valuable as those that would come from a critic. So I think that there's a kind of, and even each of his films, part of what's so fascinating about them is that he sees them in terms of classic Hollywood. I mean, he sees Colossal Youth as a remake of John Ford's Sergeant Rutledge. And to me, that opens up a whole area of way of looking at the film that makes it much more interesting, I think.
In the back here.
Hi, it's really fascinating to hear all of you talk and discuss film. My question is to all of you, and it's kind of personal. What's for you? What's the best way to view a film? As before, kind of when you're going to review, or just on any day? Is it at home, screening a film, or is it going to a festival? Is it going to a Cineplex? Is it going to a private screening room? What's your preference?
For me, it's different with every film. I wouldn't want to come up with one blanket thing. I mean, one advantage for me watching films at home on DVD is if I don't understand a line of dialogue, or if I'm writing about it, I can go back and see something again. But on the other hand, it obviously doesn't have the same impact as seeing something in 35 millimeter. I mean, when I saw here at the Lightbox Walkover last night, if I was seeing that on DVD, it wouldn't have had anything like the same impact as seeing it. So I think it's very hard to make rules, because I think that even with individual films, sometimes, I mean, when I was teaching, I had a choice of showing, to refer to Carl Dreyer again, Dreyer's Day of Wrath, either on DVD with subtitles or on 35 millimeter in in 35 millimeter without subtitles. And I chose actually to show it on DVD because I looked at it both ways, and it actually looked better. The print was better on the DVD. But there are other situations when it's obviously better to see it on 35. So I think it's very hard to make generalizations.
I guess the second part of the question is that would you review it? Because you don't know if you're going to see the film for the first time. Would you review it differently, do you think, if you saw it the first time at home or at a cinema?
All kinds of things affect you. Jean Cocteau said that, how comfortable the seat is when you're watching the film affects how you watch the film, All kinds of things come into it. So sure, I think all of these things play a role, but it's very hard to kind of know in advance whether it's going to be helpful or hurtful, or, you know, there are all kinds of factors that come into it. It's a combination of factors always.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good question. I sort of resist a lot of the exhibitors or the studios will put up this thing that you have to see it with an audience, or else you can't fully appreciate it. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Particularly where we see a lot of films, and I think you sort of you can see it in almost any environment, and you can focus your attention, and you can take something away from it. I mean, obviously, I'd love to see every film at the Lightbox because it's a great place to see films. The seats are fantastic. There's sort of a respectful attitude towards movies, but if you're engaged with the film and you're paying attention to it, I think that you can overcome almost anything. Something that Jonathan's saying as well is, a couple of nights ago, I introduced The Spirit of the Beehive, Victor Enrique's really masterful film from 1973. And I made a point of seeing it on video or on DVD a couple of weeks. Like I saw it twice before I saw it again. And there's this one scene where the mother Teresa, the woman named Teresa, she's burning a letter. And in the DVD, and it wasn't a Blu-ray, you could see the writing on the letter, which was important. You could see it on the video much clearer than on the screen, which I thought, that's interesting. I mean, it's not always the projected version isn't always the best, although it's probably the most enjoyable environment.
I don't have a ready answer. I mean, certainly during the period from the 90s on, there was a lot of stuff that was shot for that were made as movies, but were kind of aimed at TV. There was a lot of sort of shallow focus and stuff like that, and it didn't really make that much difference. And the oddity of this is the stuff that's the least where it's the least important for it to be in a big screen in terms of the cinematic quality is the stuff we're more likely to be compelled to see on the big screen with audiences, when comedies and adventure action films where they want us to watch it with an audience for supposedly the rebound effect. If everybody's oohing and awing, they think we will. But the films that have longer takes, that are more foreign films that have where the camera work in some ways is more important, we will be more likely to see them on DVD because the distributors are poorer and it's cheaper to send out DVDs and put on the screenings. The same experience with Walkover. I'd been watching it on DVD and I wasn't going to rewatch it. I'd seen it twice just recently and I just got sucked in for 40 minutes watching it on the big screen. You sort of say, oh, that's what I thought I was talking about. I mean, it's very seductive sometimes with the right artist. Yes, it is better to see it on a big screen, but not the way we see a lot of the best movies.
You know, I am film programmer for Cannes or Amiens, and we see a lot of films in DVDs, screeners, etc. So you get to have a lot of imagination to know what will the film be on the big screen, because but ancient movies, are just thinking and made for the big screen, and now maybe since the numeric is different, people ont intégré. The director know that the film will be on DVD, will be on internet, etc. So maybe there is a new way to think the mise en scène. It would be interesting to interroger, to ask to the movies, to the directors. But when you see a Fritz Lang, you have to see a Fritz Lang in a theater, on the big screen. It's good to see it on DVD, but I think there is a difference between the ancient movies and the contemporary movies, because it's always better to see movies with the audience, I think.
Since most movies are now made from multinational corporations that own the TV and the DVDs, they are making those movies with your television screen in mind, and it's fairly obvious.
I was going to say, if I ruled the world, I'd make sure every movie was shown in IMAX and none in 3D.
I think I'm an amateur critic, and the most difficult thing for me is to ignore, like I read a lot, but is ignore what other people have said when I go and see the movie. Like Jonathan, you were saying, you read a lot of stuff even before, and spoilers and stuff don't matter, but I wonder, how do you guys get to the 0 point when you go to a film? Do you ignore the hype? Can you ignore the hype? Like for stuff like The Dark Knight, where you got a lot of flack for not liking it or something, but can you ignore what other people are saying and the big movements?
Not only can you not ignore it, I think it's part of, like, when you see something, it's like everything that's happening in the culture, which is part of you, is affecting it too. So I think that ideally, and this is one of the advantages of writing for a weekly paper, when I wrote for the Reader, is that I couldn't always do it by any means, but the ideal thing was always to see a film twice if you could, because the first time is just to get rid of your expectations, and then you can see the film. And I think often you can't do that, but I think that that's the ideal situation would be that, because I think that it's sort of like expectations do play a large role, and that's even if you do, but sometimes you have, it comes in different levels, because sometimes you have a lot of reasons to have expectations. Sometimes you know nothing. You know, you just heard about a screening and you just know a title and it's at such and such a time and you turn up, you know. But so I think that varies a lot, but one always has, because genre is about expectation always, and actors too. I think that they're always a whole set. I mean, the whole way that films get financed is based on expectations even. So it's you can't really avoid it, but I think you have to kind of like try to come to terms with it in some way.
And check against, I mean, it's fine to read other people and to see other things, but I think you're always checking against your own reactions. Like, you know, that I agree with, that I don't agree with, you know, and it does, I think it helps you think better to read other people, you know, and their opinions about film. If you were to do it in isolation, you'd just be repeating yourself.
So the thing is to avoid submerging yourself. Like, don't go to Rotten Tomatoes and read 20 reviews before you go and see the movie. But if you'll see a Quentin Tarantino movie or a Terrence Malick movie, you're already bringing with you an expectation, right? If you're familiar with their work. So you're automatically you're comparing past experience against the current one. I think it to be put things in context and to be aware of what you're getting at, but just don't drown yourself in other opinion.
To talk about the Semaine de la Critique, the Critics Week, you know, when I really feel myself as a film critic is because. Semaine de la Critique is first feature film and second feature film. So you don't have any expectation. You are the first people to see that film, that movie. And after that, you're in Cannes and you're on stage with a director and you're in front of the other film critics. And that is I feel at that time, I really feel as a film critic, because I have to say, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right, but that's what we think it's a new and great director or new and great film. And that's the way I think it's good to be a film critic. So I don't have any expectations when I saw a movie, but the better is when you see a film, you know, everybody talks about it. But the thing you have to do to write, it's to know what did I not understand in that film? What questions? Begin with the questions that you can ask to the movie, and the question that the movie asks to you. You know what I mean? I don't know if... so that's the better things to do. Not to begin with the things you already know, etc. But the question, that's the point, the real point of a good critic. I think.
That's very nice. It's like the Hemingway phrase about leave out everything you know.
Hello, I have a question for Mr. Gaffez. Bonjour, Gaffez, bienvenue à Toronto. I wanted to get back to the question of place, and Mr. Rosenbaum was bringing up some excellent points about how, thanks to the internet, we no longer are kind of constrained by our geographical limitations, and you know, the audience of our films, they can be sitting, you know, wherever in the world. So I wanted to ask you about Québécois films and how, you know, if they make their way over to France and if they are received. And then for all four of you, I wanted to ask you about when you're looking at
films that are foreign language films, whether it's a totally different experience criticizing a film that's been written in a different language, even with the subtitles, or whether it's pretty much the same whether you're watching something in English or watching something in another language.
It's always interesting to see movies in a foreign country, you know, but for Québécois, Canadian, Québécois movies, there is not a lot of Québécois movies that release in France, but in festival you can see a lot of films. In Amiens, we have a selection of lastly I forgot his name. Just Jo pour Jonathan. You know, Maxime Giroux is a great new director, I think. And this year we have Roméo 11 with Nuit numéro 1. So I don't remember what was the question, but it's great to have that kind of movies. But it always made me think about Montesquieu and, you know, the Persian letters, because when you are in a different country, you feel that the films are not the same. You don't have the same point of view of the French movies, of what is good or it's always interesting. But internet maybe give us the chance to have an international of the good taste. Maybe, I don't know, but maybe we are on the way to. Everybody has to love the same thing, the same. So I prefer to travel and to feel the country and to feel the national cinematography in the country. It's always different when you see an African film in Africa. I can tell you that it's very different to when you're in Paris and you laugh before. It's a way to know and to understand the culture. And yes, I love Québécois movies.
Well, I would say that most of my education in history of cinema came from the Cinémathèque Française in Paris. But the policy then, from André Langlois, was that whenever it was possible to show the film without subtitles, and even when in silent films, when there were intertitles, to take out the intertitles, so that you couldn't. And I don't believe this, actually. I think it's better to understand what people are saying, or what the titles are, in the original language say. But at the same time, I think that it's important to have the experience. In fact, one could have it tonight of going to see a Jean Eustache film if one doesn't know French without subtitles. I think it's. It seems to me that it's even I rediscovered American cinema through French criticism, and it was very important to me. But it seems to me that part of the discoveries of American cinema and French criticism came about through not knowing English better, that they noticed other things because they didn't know the language as well. And it's interesting because the person who was perhaps the most important critic of Hitchcock, I think, was Truffaut, and Truffaut was the one whose English was the worst, actually. I think that gives you, in other words, it changes your perspective because you have to come to terms with it in different ways. It's not a complete experience, but the point is, watching any film, it's an illusion to think you're getting a complete experience. People think if they see a Godard film, and that the subtitles, like not everything is translated, that they somehow, if everything were translated, they would understand everything. It's not true. I think it's one's understanding of any film, in a way, is only partial and, as we said, subjective. So I think it's, even though it's better to know the language, it's very interesting to sometimes experience a film when one doesn't know the language.
There's a movie out right now. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's Asghar Faridi's A Separation, and I was struck watching it how universal it was. I mean, just aside from the language and the clothing, I mean, you just got so much out of that anybody, the dealing with an elderly parent, divorce, the issues of what happens in that particular movie that could happen to anybody, the strange misfortunes. But one of the things I really appreciate about foreign films is that it teaches me to respect other cultures. I'll give you one fast example is. In our culture, we tend to look down upon the idea of arranged marriages. We think they're an abomination, and that the way to meet somebody is in a bar or something, right? But when you see, I've can't tell you how many movies I've seen where they've had arranged marriages, and not all of them are presented as being a horrible thing. And it's made me reevaluate my own view of it, thinking, in some cultures that is the way to do it. There's economic and there's social reasons for doing it. And I credit film for teaching me to have a more inclusive idea of how different cultures approach marriage.
I think one of the things that interests me is when you add subtitles, you elevate a movie. If you dub it, you degrade it. You turn it into burlesque in a way. People are speaking through other people's faces, that kind of thing. You add subtitles, it makes it a little bit more pagey, a little bit more literary on some level. And you make the adjustments as you're watching it for that. Although dubbing in English is really uncommon now, but it still happens a lot in other places.
There was a fad about 10 years ago, like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, where they, and it was actually pretty good dubbing. And I think Miramax was trying to...
But in Italy still, I think, don't they, there are some places, countries where they only dub.
But when a French director now is asking, how can I win an Academy Award, Oscar? I made a silent movie. And